This session is part of the Klingendaal State of the Union Conference, online conference. And what a perfect timing to talk about European leadership just one day after the US elections. Whatever the outcome of the US elections will be, Europe has to define a response. And for that, we need European leadership. At this panel, however, we have to fight the temptation to speak all the time about what's happening in America. Not only is the outcome of the election still very unclear, there's also another conference session after this one about the EU in a new global reality after the US elections. Please do join that session as well. This panel is focusing on European leadership and not on American leadership, although these are of course interrelated and interconnected. This panel is both about internal and external European leadership. How to overcome the tensions between member states and the European institutions, how to overcome the divides between East and West and North and South within the EU, and how to deal with the populist cleavage in our societies. How does the EU position itself in a great power competition between China and the US? How does it deal with the surrounding geopolitical challenges of Putin's Russian Federation and Erdogan's Turkey? What about Europe's techno-economic leadership or the lack of it? What about the Franco-German axis before and after Angela Merkel leaves the stage? This panel is also about European sovereignty and strategic autonomy, two phrases that are the talk of the town in today's seminars. In short, what we want to discuss this afternoon are the potentials and the limits of European leadership. Again, very much welcome to this session. My name is René Cuperus, Klingendaal Research Fellow, and I am glad to host a panel of really outstanding speakers this coming hour. From Brussels, we welcome Professor Luc van Middelaar, insider and outsider expert of the EU and author of some very famous books, The Passage to Europe and Alarums and Excursions. From Warsaw, we welcome Piotr Buras, head of the Warsaw office of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And from the Netherlands and New York, we welcome Helene Mees, economist and China expert, also opinion writer. And last but not least, we have a royal visit today. Locked down in London, we welcome Emperor Charlemagne from The Economist, also known as Duncan Robinson. Thank you so much for participating. I also want to introduce my co-host, Michiel Emmelkamp, strategist at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Michiel will closely monitor the chat questions and comments of our viewers and bring them in later in the debate. So please, if you watch this panel discussion in the Netherlands or in any other country, don't hesitate to comment or ask questions through the chat function. We will try to include the audience as good as possible in the second part of our panel. Without further ado, let's now start with the panel discussion itself. I will keep the order of appearance as given by the program. So Luc van Middelaar, I want to give the digital floor to you first. You are an expert on European leadership, having written about the role of the European Council, about the distinction between rules-based politics and event-based politics within the EU, and about the complex machinery of the Franco-German motor bloc. Please, could you give us your view based on your experience on the actual state of European leadership and how it should evolve? Luc, can I give you the floor?
Thank you, René.
Okay, right.
Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction and all these pertinent questions. Well, as we're all zoomed in the news, it might have been useful to start zooming out, indeed, and avoid the temptation to start with which you mentioned. And zooming out, I think the fundamental of European leadership from the start has been that there was not supposed to be any leadership at all, in the sense that there was supposed to be nobody the boss. Not France, not Germany, not the central institutions. Hence, we have an institutional framework full of balances and procedures so that nobody could really lead. Now, this was, of course, great for what European Union has achieved in building a market, but the lesson, the discovery of the past decade is that in crisis politics, you do need leadership. Once you have a currency, once you share borders, once you have aspirations in foreign policy, like the European Union has, you do need leadership. Now, what we see is that some of that has been invented, has been improvised, but the first lesson still holds. That is to say, in Europe, the leadership is always collective leadership. And this brings me to some of the players you mentioned. Three are of primordial importance in the past and today: French president, German chancellor, Commission president. And a new actor, if you want, the president of the European Council, who has to connect some further dots. Now, what I find interesting, if we look back the past few months, perhaps few years, is that all these three actors have realized really that they cannot lead alone and that they have to act jointly. I think this was discussed also yesterday in the fascinating session on migration, which I happened to listen to. The new Commission President, von der Leyen, has understood that she cannot, unlike her predecessor Juncker, lead on migration alone against the wish of member states. Macron is also understanding, unlike previous presidents, that France can perhaps want to go faster than other member states, but still needs to bring the others along. And Germany, of course, that's the most momentous shift during the pandemic, that Angela Merkel is no longer, let's say, part of the North when it comes to economic and Eurozone issues, but has moved to the center. That is a huge shift. So all three of these actors realize that they're in it together, and that as a result, the Corona Recovery Fund was a big breakthrough. Now, of course, not all other players like that. There's opposition also to this kind of government, but I think that is a massive change. Now, I don't know whether you want me to say a few words on the US election, or you want to postpone all of that, but
maybe in terms of what it means for European leadership.
Well, if I look at these players, I think a Trump victory, everything is still possible, would be good for France in some way, as it vindicates the French view on strategic autonomy. I mean, frankly, the French have been exasperated with the German approach to the Trump administration, as in just sitting it out, waiting until it's over, just get to these past 4 years. So we cannot have another 4 years of that. Thinking would be in Paris, and I would tend to agree. I mean, strategic patience is fine, but at some point it becomes irresponsible slowness. Now, a Biden victory would in a way strengthen the hand of Berlin as the most transatlantic partner. Of course, Trump has taken Merkel as a kind of antagonist internationally. So if Biden comes, he will look to Merkel to repair the transatlantic relationship. Mm-hmm. And that scenario obviously is also better for the Commission and for the European Union as a whole.
Okay.
Perhaps to conclude, one element which I think is underestimated on Trump in the past 4 years, and which would continue in the years ahead, is that a Trump victory will also strengthen all the mini Trumps in Central and Eastern Europe, who have been behind the scenes encouraged by the US administration to hold out against Brussels and Berlin on the rule of law. I'm thinking about Warsaw, Budapest, but also Ljubljana. We have seen this morning the congratulations of the Slovenian Prime Minister to Trump already, for instance. So to sum up that point on a Trump victory would increase the urgency for Europe to be more autonomous strategically, but at the same time makes it more difficult because of the West-East split it will further entrench. So far, thanks. Looking forward to hearing the others and discussing further in a second.
Thank you very much for this great analysis already, Luc. We will elaborate on that later. I hope we have time for that. Thank you very much. And now we go over to Piotr Buras in Warsaw. a well-known voice from Poland. We know each other already for a long time. He's based in Warsaw, capital of a divided country. It's a complex story about Poland. It's both economically booming, but it's also governed by radical national conservative forces. See the massive abortion demonstrations last week in several cities in Poland. Where's Piotr? I don't see him yet. Piotr, could you enlighten us about the Polish situation, and especially about the rule of law issue? Does this stand in the way for European leadership, is one of the questions. How could we overcome the East-West divide, especially after a Trump electoral victory? And what is Western Europe doing wrong in this domain? Piotr, could you please elaborate on these questions?
Yes, thank you very much, René, and thank you for inviting me to join this fascinating conversation. I would like to start with just a very brief reaction on what Luc said, because I found it very interesting, and of course also his both books, but especially the recent one, where he made the point about the politics of events and how this basically provided for a stronger role of the European Council and European leaders when it comes to the shaping of the EU agenda. And I think indeed, if we talk about leadership, I would say a few words about what it looks like from the Central Eastern European perspective. But when we talk about the leadership in the EU, so we definitely need to look at the EU member states, because there are of course certain areas where the Commission can provide leadership. But I think, and this is also the finding from Luc's book, that in the most recent crisis, and this refers also to the upcoming crisis or challenges related also to the outcome of the American election, I think we will face problems which are not covered by the EU treaties. And then basically the question is the unforeseen problems where you don't have particular rules, particular regulations, and you need to react spontaneously. And then the question is, of course, especially when
it's precise about it. It's not so clear for me what you mean by this.
That for example, if you have the migration crisis, or if you have foreign policy crisis, and you need to take quick decisions, solve problems, and even in the Euro crisis, you basically need to reinvent certain rules or reinvent certain procedures. You need to find new solutions, and then no EU institution is able to do that. You need basically to get together as the leaders of the EU member states and decide and find something. And here, I think when it comes to foreign and security policy, especially, it's very interesting to look at Germany and France, of course, because I think if you try to understand what it takes to be a leader, so you need basically two ingredients. You need legitimacy and you need resolve. And you need legitimacy, and which is derived from, I would say, from two things. Inclusive approach, so you basically try to consult others, you try to get everybody on board and lead from the center, as Ursula von der Leyen famously said a couple of years ago. And you need also requires also a certain willingness to take an unproportionate burden on your shoulders. So basically, if you want to lead, you also need to be prepared to take more responsibility. But you also need resolve, and this is based on, I think, usually on strong interests, national interests, like even Germany in the migration crisis. That was a national interest of Germany to solve the crisis, because it was the country which was very much affected by it.
But sorry, Piotr, if you apply this to Central Eastern Europe, this leadership of Germany and France is not working at all in the migration issue towards Central and Eastern Europe.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. but still, that was an attempt to lead the European Union on a certain issue. But you also need a certain potential to which you can use, a potential in meaning, you know, a military potential or economic potential, which you can basically put in place. And my point is only, just very briefly on France and Germany, that if you look at both countries, it's very difficult to say that any of them fulfills both criteria. I think when it comes to legitimacy of leadership, Germany fares quite well because it's very inclusive. It's you know, it's trying to lead from the center, but it's actually when it comes to resolve, especially on foreign and security policy issues, a lot of could be done much better, and resolve is not really Germany's strength. In France, with France, and here comes to Central Eastern Europe, I think, you know, France has the ambition to lead the European Union on foreign and security policy issues, and is extremely, you know, resolved and determined to do that. But you know, the legitimacy of all those actions is very questionable. If you look at the overtures towards Putin last year, if you take even the French policy in the Eastern Mediterranean this year, on trying basically to do things without any consultation within the European Council and with other partners. So I think that's here's the problem, which I see, how to make sure that you basically have both legitimacy and resolve when it comes to the main players in the European Union. And this is probably the problem which needs to be solved somehow in the upcoming months and years. And I think Germany is progressing towards more resolve, but I think it's still not there yet. And when it comes to Central Eastern Europe, just two very brief observations. I think one is on rule of law, and I think this is quite sometimes very wrongly phrased in the European debate, that we have many divisions between East and West on climate, on foreign policy, on Russia, on several other, and on rule of law. So the rule of law is one of the divisions between East and West. I think this is fundamentally wrong, because rule of law is not just one of the policy areas. The rule of law is the foundation of the whole bloc. And I think, you know, and this is for me, this is the crisis of the rule of law and democracy within the European Union is probably the most fundamental crisis we have at the moment, although it's a creeping crisis. But still, and then some, you know, we don't see the everyday the consequences of that. But I think we are at a watershed moment with the EU budget discussions and the rule of law mechanism. And if we now basically allow Orban and Kaczynski to play with the veto successfully, which they try to do, this battle will be lost for a very long time. And I think Luke is absolutely right that Trump's possible, but I think not very probable, hopefully, victory in this election would very much embolden the Central Eastern European autocrats. And the last point I wanted to mention on Central Eastern Europe and on the divisions. I think, of course, there are many policy areas where the interests diverge, but I think there is something much between East and West. But I think there is something more fundamental which does affect the whole leadership issue in a great deal. And this is the fact that there is over the last years, something very significant happened to the process of European integration, because European integration initially was a process very much driven by internal issues, internal challenges to overcome the legacy of the Second World War, reconciliation, economic convergence in Europe, to overcome the divide of Europe, Cold War divide, and so on and so forth. And that was the process the Central Eastern European countries very much benefited from. So basically, all these goals I mentioned, they were very much in the interest of Central Eastern Europe. Now we have a situation where the European integration is very much defined by the responses to external challenges. So the negative effects of globalization is driving the debate about how to protect West European labor markets. The American retrenchment is driving the discussion about how Europe should take responsibility for the southern neighborhood of the European Union. The migration flows are defining the European solidarity in a completely different way than it was the case at the time of the European enlargement.
Try to make a conclusion.
Yeah, and that means that I think there is some very structural problem that the Central Eastern Europe feels quite discomforted with by the direction in which the European Union as such is going. And this is a very, as I said, a structural problem. It's not that this is just only because of bad policies or bad leadership. But this, I think, creates a completely different context also for the debate about the European leadership and how to bridge the divides within the European Union.
Mm. And one follow-up question, this authoritarianism in Central Eastern Europe, is that a response to these new external challenges, or is it a more domestic problem?
I think this is both.
What's the source? What's the real source of that?
I think this is both. This is a response to a certain, feeling of huge parts of the society being worried about the future, being worried about the fact that the industrial production is delocalized, that the world around them is changing. This is what is fueling basically West European populism so much. And the response to that is what we perceive in Central Eastern Europe, some protectionist tendencies, right? Mm-hmm. And that creates a different image of the European Union, where basically some benefits we got accustomed to in the past are no longer there and no longer available.
Okay, thank you. We'll leave it here. We took a bit more time for Central Eastern Europe because that's lacking in most discussions in Western Europe. So I like to have your story from Central Europe, from Warsaw. Thank you very much. Now we go over to Helene Maes, an economist who wrote many op-eds about American-European comparisons and about the China shock. And I would like to ask Helene to answer from your more global perspective and based on your expertise as an economist, how you would assess the state of European leadership in between USA and China. Techno-economic leadership, geopolitical leadership. What could the EU learn from China and or the US in this respect? You are writing a lot about that, and I'd like to learn your reflections on that. Thank you very much.
Well, I think I bring much more of an outsider perspective than the other participants in this Zoom conference, because in the past decade, the number of European companies in Forbes list with the world's 100 largest company has dwindled. So in the Forbes top 10, for example, there are 5 Chinese companies, 4 American companies, and there's only 1 European company, and that's Royal Dutch Shell. In the top 20, you only find 1 other European company, and that's the Volkswagen Group. Almost all European companies in the Forbes 100 are more than a century old. The only European company in the Forbes top 100 that has been founded in the past 25 years is InBev, a Belgian beer producer. How symbolic is that? Europe completely missed out on the digital revolution. It does not have a major producer of computers or smartphones, such as Microsoft, Apple, or Samsung, nor does Europe have any major internet companies, such as Google, Amazon, Alibaba, or Facebook. That's not only problematic from an economic viewpoint, but it also raises questions of national security, as we are wholly dependent on American companies for our social media, search machines, and cloud storage. Soon we will depend on China for our G6 network. And why is the EU lagging? Well, the EU member states mostly compete against each other. Which genius thought that it was a good idea to have 4 airport hubs within a radius of 500 kilometers. That is Paris, London, Frankfurt, and Amsterdam. And which genius thought it was smart to have 4 tax havens within that same radius? That is Ireland, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Belgium. In a multipolar world, the EU must strive to be a player in strategic industries. They can pull it off by working together and not competing with each other. Look at Airbus, which turned itself into a worthy competitor of Boeing. Europeans are very good at elementary research, but Europeans are not very good at translating their research into profitable business ideas. Some researchers blame that on the red tape coming from Europe. But I think European culture is also part of the problem. And instead of investing all of the 700 billion euro for the next generation EU in individual member states, the money should in part be used for common strategic projects between the member states where they cooperate. The EU should have bigger aspirations than keeping itself afloat. Mm-hmm. That's what I want to say. We have to be more like, I'm sorry, the European Union, like the Klingendals, Robert Kagan said, like, Europeans are only busy with each other. They only talk about each other. They're not, really think about their position in the world. And if I hear this discussion again, then I'm like, I think everybody missed out on, on where we are in the economic perspective. And I think if we want to keep afloat in a world like the investment fund that the next generation EU, for the next generation EU, if it's going to go to keep individual member states afloat, it will not bring us further in the world. It will just be Europe waiting for the next crisis. And we need to be a competitor, because otherwise we're going to be sorely dependent on America and China, and we hardly can compete with them right now.
You don't see any positive developments here, because I see a new consciousness in Europe about this geopolitical, geoeconomic reality. And you did not mention Nokia and Ericsson. And some people say they are even more advanced than in 5G developments than American companies.
Yeah, they're more advanced. That's completely true, but they're not as advanced as Huawei. So that's why that's talked about G6. Of course, we can now maybe G5 we can't do it as good as Huawei can do it.
But the question is, how do we organize such an economic leadership? As we listen to Luc, the EU is designed without leadership, without command and control. And for your geo-economic powerhouse, you need very strong leadership. How should we do that?
Well,
can I come in with a question here, René? Is it okay?
Yes, please.
Which is actually, I mean, if you look at the current situation,
taking the stage.
Being here as the sidekick and putting in the questions also from the Q&A. But I think we increasingly see that also geopolitical conflicts are very much being fought out, not by military means, but by economic means. Countries imposing sanctions, putting economic coercion on, for instance, EU companies and member states. And one would say that if there is one field where the EU has power and can show leadership, it is in the economic field. At the same time, I think indeed the EU has not been very well at doing that, which is perhaps also a sort of fundamental issue, which is that the EU is wary of using for economic policies for political aims. The EU has been started as, it was founded to have trade integration for peace rather than a weaponization of the economy. We want an international legal order rather than great power politics. So my question is, do you think the EU should also engage more in this sort of economic power politics, this geoeconomic geopolitics, or do you think the EU should actually stay away from that? And what would EU economic power projection look like in this sort of new era of geoeconomic power competition?
Well, was it your own question or a question by the audience, or a mix?
So far, this is my own question, but after this, I will throw in more questions from the Q&A.
I come back to you later.
Yes, I can invite anyone to ask more questions.
First, I think Europe should try to remain relevant. You know, we only have companies, rather big players in really old industries. We don't have any big players in new industries. I don't want to bring up the election, but it will depend on whether we can have a strategic partnership with the United States to compete with China. Because you see, China is also not afraid of using economic sanctions or, you know, threaten with reducing the imports, for example, of German pork, to pressure the Europeans to take positions that China likes. And I think we should be very afraid of that. But we also have to be afraid of what happens in the United States. Because if we were fully dependent on our internet on the United States, you know, if the internet companies just decide to give us our data much lower or show European companies later in their search results at a lower page, it will already be detrimental to our position. So we shouldn't want to be that dependent. And with Airbus, we have shown that we can compete with the United States. And I think that if European countries work together, I'm not so much the institutionalist here among the panelists. But what you need is to have an overarching vision and to see that projects, how you want to compete. Yeah, well, you have a leader like Angela Merkel, but she's leaving. So I think it is also about a mindset, and that European countries really have to learn to talk less about themselves, less about the European Union, which is difficult because it's a project under construction. But you really want the European Union to pay more attention on what's happening around them.
Thank you, Helene. I think that's an important warning. And indeed, the EU tends to be quite inward-looking and not very much outward-looking. And I think it's a good warning there's a lot of talk in Brussels about new industrial policies in the direction you are talking about. But we are late, and it's late. It's always slow. So it's the big question is: are we fit for the world competition in this respect? So thanks for this warning. Now we go over to our last panelist, to Duncan Robinson from The Economist. Every week you are following closely European leadership in the corridors of power in Brussels. And my question to you is, how are you, based on your experience, looking at how the EU is handling in these corridors the COVID crisis, Brexit, Turkey, Belarus? How do you assess internal European leadership, the machinery of Brussels, and the permanent struggle between European institutions and the member states? What can be improved in the machinery of Brussels to be more effective in terms of external leadership? Duncan, please.
Well, I think the best way of describing the state of European leadership at the moment is almost strength through weakness. So in terms of the institutions, you have Charles Michel and Ursula von der Leyen at the top of the two most important ones. And I don't think anyone would say that they're particularly outstanding leaders or particularly strong, but that in its own way has been an advantage. And the best way of explaining that is through the Recovery Fund. Now, this was a very member state driven idea. It sort of emerged in Spain. It floated up through Paris and Berlin as well, with the idea of these sort of grants. And the Commission basically behaved as a civil service. It sometimes acts like it's sort of the EU's proto-government, but in this case, it sort of took a big step back and sort of just enabled the member states to take the lead on it. And it's a similar thing with Charles Michel as well. He doesn't behave like he's the sort of boss of the European Council. He behaves like it's the broker. It's his job to make the 27 people sat around that table who have the power actually agree. And the results of that have been quite good. In that at the start of the crisis, things looked pretty rough. And now, after a few months into it, you emerged with this sort of Hamiltonian moment, and what was a massive and necessary step in European integration. And it took place under what is objectively pretty weak leadership in the EU institutions. Now, the reason weakness works in terms of EU institutions is because you do at the moment have relatively strong leadership in national capitals. You have Emmanuel Macron in Paris, who loves using Europe as a sort of canvas of power, and you have Merkel in Berlin, who's just the sort of Copernican constant of the EU solar system. And I think the best way of demonstrating that is with a counterfactual. So what if there was strong leadership in Brussels? And a good example of that would be, imagine if Merkel had become Commission President, which wasn't an outlandish suggestion before von der Leyen's selection. It was a sort of outside bet. And there's no doubt she would have been a much stronger leader than von der Leyen. But would it have been better for Europe? Probably not. You would have been left with a weak chancellor in Berlin who couldn't have pushed through the massive political shift that was necessary in German politics. And indeed, if Brussels was seen as sort of too strong, it might have created even more opposition to it and made a deal even harder. And so weak leadership within EU institutions, when it's coupled with strong leadership on a national level, it keeps power where people can see it and where people can understand it, which is in national capitals. So, but the only problem with that is one for the future, which is what happens if you have weak leadership in Brussels and weak leadership in the national capitals? Well, then things obviously get quite bad. But I'm not sure that can be sort of solved from sort of top down in Brussels. You can sort of see that with foreign policy. Now, I imagine like both Charles Michel and von der Leyen have tried to make foreign policy a big part of their agendas, but neither sort of quite has the competency, either personally or institutionally, to do much about it. For the simple reason that European countries don't have a common foreign policy. They disagree too much on really, really fundamental differences. And even if you had the world's most talented leaders dumped on top of the EU institutions as they are now, I don't think that would change anything. And that's because ultimately strong leadership for Brussels, I don't think can ever compensate for weak or divided national capitals. And I don't think that's sort of ever been the case in an EU perspective. Even if you go back to people like Delors, etc., they were only to push through their vision because they had the consent of national capitals. They work together. And so I think the best way of understanding the EU is that it's a tool which EU governments have to try and use as effectively as they can. And if they fail to get good results, then it's on them. That's where the blame lies.
Okay, thank you very much. Great analysis, I think. You are, I think you are emphasizing the strong role of the member states, the capitals in this European construction, completely denying, of course, the populist idea of a super state in Brussels. That's not a very realistic vision. The big question is this interplay between capitals and Brussels, is this really leading to European leadership, both internally and externally? Or will this be a chronicle weakness, and we cannot solve that? And will it be enough in the great power competition? What are you optimistic about this kind of leadership in the long run? Would be my question to you.
I think it's always going to be a bit of a mess while you still have fundamentally different strategic aims within the bloc. I know that's a bit like saying, oh, I wouldn't start from here, but the fact is the countries in the EU have radically different views on how to deal with Turkey or how to deal with Russia or how to deal with Africa. And just simply sort of dumping a new structure on top of that and having an EU presidency and having the most charismatic leader there on top of it, I don't think it solves that issue. I think you're just going to have to live with that tension and sort of grind on to reach sort of lowest common denominator consensus where you can on these issues, and then hopefully that it doesn't end up going too badly.
Okay, so for you, concepts like European sovereignty and strategic autonomy are bullocks. Bullshit.
Yeah, no, I don't think they're bollocks. I think that you can still, be autonomous, but that doesn't mean you have this sort of very top-down, individualistic, very Brussels-centered way of running things. I don't think that's sort of necessarily mutually exclusive. And I think you can eventually grind people around to this idea that Europe does need to act more independently, because I'm not an expert in Eastern Europe anymore, but I would be nervous about how much interest a US truly has in their national security. And they need to realize that they have a bigger potential allies closer to home, and maybe they need to stop pissing them off. And so, but that's going to take time. I don't think you can sort of wave a magic wand and have this sort of magical sort of Deus Ex Machina leader that's going to come in and sort of weave Europe into a single actor. It's always going to be a bit of a mess.
Okay, thank you. Great. Before we go to Michael Emmelkamp and to let in politely the audience, with their questions from the chat. Are there, I cannot see the panelists in my screen, but are there any reactions or reflections on other panelists which are urgent at the moment? Maybe Luc van Middelaar wants to react to this last intervention.
Yeah, thank you, René.
Please do reflect on some of the contributions.
I'm sorry?
Please do reflect on some of the contributions.
Yeah, I think it was very stimulating what Helene Maes said on the intensity and the enormity of the strategic challenge, economically and technologically. And although I agree with the gist of Duncan's analysis on the situation of internal leadership, on the interplay between Brussels and the capitals, that was also my initial take half an hour ago. I think Brussels should still try and do a bit more in terms of providing a shared vision, a perspective on where you want to go. So very briefly, coming back to my idea of collective leadership, what you need in the European Union, the EU being what it is. There is the European Council, where the 27 heads of government come together with the Commission President and the President of the European Council itself. So that is one place where they should, I know it's difficult, I mean, I work by myself, but they should spend more time on forging, let's say, a shared strategic view on the challenges. Now, it's a very reactive, crisis-driven body, but they should continue to make space to reflect on China, to reflect on the US, to reflect on and take decisions ideally. And there, the interplay between the Commission, who should do proposals, and they could go in the direction of some of the things Helene Maes has said, to bring these together so that we are not simply giving up basically on doing more than surviving, which maybe will not be enough. But I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Luc. Very good. I'm looking at the clock now, and I think this is a good moment to start with the questions and comments in the chat. I will give the floor to Michiel Emmelkamp now to give a short overview or a selection of some of the most interesting questions, and then the panelists can respond to them. Michiel, where are you?
Yes, thank you very much, René. Yeah, I think in the chat there are a lot of questions actually about this matter of economic policy and European economic strength. So maybe it's logical to put that question back to Helene, who put this issue very prominently on the agenda, and feel free for the others, of course, to chip in. But for instance, Kees Siebinga asked, are you actually advocating for a stronger competition and R&D policy? But Adriaan Schout from the Klingendahl Institute asks, are you advocating for an EU level action, but what is the role of member states herein? Are member states critical to push all this forward? And that's also a question for Kevin Kelly, which is, which role can mid-sized member states like the Netherlands play therein? So maybe you can elaborate a bit more on the practical economic agenda.
Well, yeah, that's, well, I think the first thing, every member state can contribute in bigger projects like Airbus, but let's have the next generation Airbus in another field, of course, which is strategic, but they can contribute because they have their own geniuses. You know, like Eastern Europe have brilliant minds, especially in areas where Western European minds are lacking, that is science and math and such or so on. So I don't think there's much controversial about a project by trying to be huge to take economic leadership in fields. And if you have that 700 billion euros at hand anyways, so why shouldn't you think like strategic areas? And then it's not only Nokia Ericsson, but how are we going to think about the G6, G7 and the G8? How are we going to compete with China? Because the only reason why Nokia and Ericsson now have a chance to compete on G5 is because we block G5 from supplying our G5 networks in Europe. in most European countries. So I don't think it should be that controversial. It will be more controversial to say like giving up Amsterdam Schiphol Airport is already very difficult. Well, this would actually be a very good occasion with the coronavirus to end all subsidies. And, you know, we have too many airports. Europeans take too many vacations because of that. And they should become really much more serious about world challenges that they face. So that would be a way to go about it. Yeah, I'm not sure whether it's, so I don't think any European country would be against having a big multinational. What did we do with all the institutions? We divided them over the member states. Why shouldn't we do that? If we create a big create a big player internet company, why shouldn't we put it as somewhere in Poland or something, so that it gives prestige, it gives, people can give their scientists over there. I think that would be not too difficult to realize and not too difficult for Europeans to agree upon. It would be much easier than for the Europeans to agree upon abolishing their tax regimes, like the Netherlands doesn't want to give up its tax haven status, nor wants Ireland. So I think actually these positive things instead do a lot of industrial politics, like invest much more in research and development like China does. And the United States officially, the government doesn't support science. The Trump government cut a lot of funding. But like Silicon Valley would never have been there without the Defense Department. So because of all the funding they got from there. So I think we should also reconsider the EU, and I work myself in the competition department of the EU. Our state, not only the state aid, but also our mergers and acquisition. Because if we want to create a big player, we shouldn't, you know, the European Commission should not veto every merger between European companies, because then we'll never get a big player, and we will just be like in Madurodam, which is a tiny image of the world as it is, or the Netherlands as it is. Okay, but we should be much bigger.
Thank you. Michiel, are there other panelists who wants to respond to this issue, or do you have other questions, Michiel?
Well, there are some questions about Eastern Europe in the chat as well, so we'll move to Piotr in a moment.
We have still 10 minutes left.
Yeah, so maybe we can briefly invite Duncan to respond to this. Do you share Helene's optimism? In a recent column in The Economist, you, under the title of Strategic Yogurt, you described how basically within the EU there is still a very big paradigmatic discussion going on basically an economic visions, a more protectionism versus a more market-oriented vision, and also on some of these key challenges. So how optimistic are you to see an ambitious EU policy in these fields in the forthcoming years?
Well, in terms of economic policy and in terms of lots of other policies, the EU is starting to look very, very French. I think the French have been the most sort of quick and ambitious in seizing the opportunities of Brexit, which did sort of fundamentally sort of shift the balance of power within the EU. You now don't have this sort of handbrake on these sorts of quite statist, dirigist policies, and the French have been very savvy about that and have moved quite quickly. On the other side, I think the Dutch have also played it relatively well, because they know that my impression is they know they can't stop this. But I think I get the impression that they can sort of smooth off the worst of the excesses, and so they don't end up, you know, living under the yoke of the sort of French view of governments. And so there is this interesting dynamic there. But in terms of the overall direction, it only seems to be shifting one way, and that's towards this much more sort of statist view of things, with sort of European champions and basically every single sort of French economic goal of the past 20 years actually going onto the to-do list.
Thanks very much. René, is there room to move to Eastern Europe for
Yes, please. Yeah.
Well, perfect.
Yes. Go on.
Well, because there are two questions on that, which partially link to the economic issue, but actually widen up the discussion as well. So Piotr, over to you. The first question from Tala Dolat Shahi, if I pronounce it correctly, is how can the nationalism in Eastern Europe impact this overall leadership? And Jan Willem van der Vossen takes a very precautionary approach. He says, are we also on these fields, but also on rule of law fields, expecting too much from Eastern European member states? In his analysis, from Soviet domination to a mature rule of law based democracy and market economies in barely 30 years, isn't that too much to ask? So what is the Eastern European perspective on some of these issues?
You know, I'm not sure if this is a Eastern European perspective. It's probably just my personal perspective, but I think essentially that I don't like this focus on nationalism, to be honest. I mean, to framing this discussion as a conflict between the nationalist Central Eastern Europe and I don't know, pro-European Western Europe, or because this is what is implied, and I think it's wrong. I think we have also nationalist forces, very strong ones in Western Europe. We have also countries in Central Eastern Europe which are not so much driven by nationalist feelings. I think what is essentially the problem is indeed not nationalism when it comes to the European Union, because there are some shades of gray across Europe. But this is what is really a problem is rule of law. And this is and I think this is the red line, because if we frame the problem in Europe in terms of nationalism versus Europeanism, not so much can be done. This is a discussion about emotions. This is a discussion about approaches, perspectives, feelings. But if we talk about the rule of law, we are talking about something extremely concrete. We are talking about especially judicial independence. And this is the realm where the European Union can do something. We cannot, you know, stop national emotions across Europe, but we can do very concrete things to stop the autocrats undermining the foundations of the national democracies and the European Union as such. And I think this is what should be the focus of the European debate, and this is why I think this discussion about rule of law mechanism linked to the EU budget is so important, because using the EU funds as a tool to protect the foundations of the EU is the right thing. And I think we should not basically be too much worried about the threats coming from the autocrats, because they are also bluffing, and that's why I believe that this is the real problem we are facing, and this is of course not only restricted to Central Eastern Europe, but the fact is that two most problematic countries at the moment are placed there.
Okay. Thank you, Piotr. Michiel, we have space for one more last question from the audience.
Well, actually, I think we've gone through all the questions that have been posed.
Okay.
Let me check if there are others that have just come in. No, that's it for now. Well, yeah. Well, actually,
otherwise we have time for
which is the Nietzsche and Nassi, I think, correctly asked. So the discussion, understandably, gravitates towards strategic economical policies. But has defense and security been discussed? Looking at the possible continuation of the Trump administration and his vision on the future of multilateralism, especially NATO. And I think that's an important issue to add to the discussion. So perhaps is there anyone who wants to respond to that?
Luc, something for you?
Well, thank you, René. Well, I think the person missed the start, so this is more for the next hour, I think. Defense policy, but it brings me to something Duncan said about the EU becoming more French, and he linked it to Brexit in particular. And well, I'm sorry for my friend and colleague based in London, but I think in this respect Brexit is an utter sideshow. The reason the EU is becoming more French in its thinking and acting is because the French have never stopped thinking about the use of power in the economic sphere. And with all the geo-economic changes, we have also been discussing the way China uses its power to further its economic interest, the way America, either under Trump and also one may imagine under the Biden administration, will do so, requires for Europe to also respond in a more strategic way with its economic policies to these things. And the French, of course, were always a little bit uncomfortable with the Brussels official doctrine, which denied the existence of power in the international domain, multilateralism, trade policy, etc. So they have just never stopped thinking about it. And now we need that kind of thinking. And that is why, in my view at least, that's the main reason. I mean, there is of course some Brexit-related aspects as well, but that's the main reason why we see this dominance, let's say, on the ideas market of ideas from Paris. And the interesting thing, therefore, is that also in Germany now, take German Minister Altmaier, they're taking this up, and they understand that we need to work on this further.
Yeah, especially because the elections right today are also a big warning sign. You know, if it had been a landslide, we might have taken things for granted that Trump was to be a one-time phenomenon. But we now know for sure that we never can count on America in the same way as we did in the past century. For that reason alone, we do have to play power economics. Not power politics, but power economics. And I think it should not be too difficult to reach an agreement with other member states on that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have no time anymore. We are close to 3 o'clock. We have to conclude this Klingendahl panel. I want to summarize some of the discussion, but I don't really have time for that. I want to thank you, great speakers, Luc, Piotr, Helene, and Duncan. One of the nightmare conclusions was that European leadership means to become a French Europe. That's not for all countries, and for all Dutchmen is that really a dream come true. It depends on how you define that. I also think that the panel overall was all supporting the idea of European leadership, but there were some doubts whether this could be worked out, yes or no. Weakness was one of the strong words by Duncan. Looking at European leadership, the first word is weakness. So I think we have to elaborate on these kind of discussions to really get into our mindset, what it means to become a European powerhouse in a global competitive world. So thanks again to the speakers, Luc, Piotr, Helene, and Duncan. Thanks to my sidekick, Michiel. Many thanks for the viewers and their good questions. And please continue to watch the sessions of the Klingendahl online conference. I think in 4 o'clock, there starts a new one on international politics, defense, and security, and what the American election outcome might mean for European leadership. So please join that session as well. On behalf of the Klingendahl Institute, I want to thank everyone for your attention. Have a nice day. Thank you very much.